All right, we are moving on to kind of an isolated unit from what we've been working on. We're going to touch base on exponents and negative bases. Your learning target today, you can simplify exponents with integer bases. Remember, integers just mean that positive and negative whole numbers. Okay, integers are whole numbers and their opposites is the actual definition. You need to know the definition of exponents. It's repeated multiplication by the same number. Repeated multiplication by the same number. That's what it is. Repeated multiplication by the same number. That same number is what we call the base. Okay? That same number is the base. Okay, I took a screenshot of a typical, we call, these things combined are called a power, and that's what this is saying, this little bracket thing is saying this whole unit, we call it a power, okay? It's not an exponent. A power has a base, the big number, and an exponent, that little number, okay? Combined, they are what's called a power, all right? So it just means repeated multiplication of the base, the exponent times. Repeat that. It's repeated multiplication of the base, however many times the exponent has up there. So 2 to the 6 is multiplying 2 by itself 6 times. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 64. Okay? The base, this just tells us that the base 2 is used as a factor 6 times. Multiplied by itself. All right. You need to know that before we can do other things, okay? Now we will go to writing exponents. We want to first identify what the base is. So you identify base and how many times it's going to repeat, or that's going to tell us the exponent. So you identify the base and how many times it will repeat. And then we have, if a negative is repeated, we put in parentheses, okay? This is like we have a bullet 1, bullet 2, bullet 3 of main ideas of writing exponents. This is saying if a negative is repeated, that means it's part of the base. If a negative is part of the base, we need to tell it that it needs to stay in a home with the base. How we do that is we put it in parentheses. So if a negative is repeated, we're going to put into parentheses to tell the problem solver that they're going to be repeating it. And we always want to put proper, this is just proper math etiquette, you always want to put in alphabetical order. Maybe put a little star. Numbers are always first. That's coefficients, right? Numbers represent coefficients. Coefficients are always the number in front of the variable. So numbers first, and then put in alphabetical order. All right, we're going to practice applying this concept. Let's simplify this first example. We have negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. What's the base? What's being repeated? Okay, huh? Go ahead and just tell me.
Negative 5.
Negative 5 is being repeated. Whoops. Is a negative 5 going with it constantly, right? Then I have to follow this rule that the negative 5 goes into parentheses. And then how many times did I repeat? 4. So it's negative 5 to the 4th. Okay, so next one. We have 4 times y times x times y. All right, let's just start with the numbers, because numbers always go first. I can't combine 4 with anything, right? So it just stays 4. And then what's next in alphabetical order would be the x, right? X stays put. And then how many y's do I have?
2.
Y squared. 4xy squared. Some of you might go 4y squared x, and that is totally acceptable. What property tells me that I can flip things around? Commutative property. Says, you know what, multiplication, I can flip numbers around if I want to. We just have good etiquette and always put it in alphabetical order. Okay, negative 2 times 2, right? So what do I have as that base? Do I have negative 2 or 2 as the base? I only have one negative 2. This is a 2. So this is really negative on the outside, but 2 is the base. This is just saying negative 1 times all this. Okay, the negative is not a part of the 2. And I know that because it's not over here with it. So it would be negative 2 squared, because I have 2 of them. Next thing in alphabetical order is A. I have A to the 1, 2, A squared, B to the 1, 2, 3. Cubed, I call that cubed. So it's negative 2 squared, A squared, B cubed. Okay, another one. Negative 6 times 6 times 6 times 6. Write what you think it's going to be. Think, pair, share. And then you're going to see if you are right. All right, looking closely at this, I see that 6 is repeating. So I know just a positive 6 is my base, because the only thing repeating is that 6, not a negative 6. And then I have a negative out front, so I just put it out front. And 6 repeats 1, 2, 3, and 4 times. So it's negative 6 to the 4th. Okay? Now this gets confusing when you're dealing with negative numbers. I developed some cool rules that are associated with it. The little relationships, I call it important relationships. You have 2 situations when you're dealing with negative bases. It will either look like this first one or the second one. The first one, the negative is inside parentheses. The second one, the negative is just kind of sticking out. If it looks like this, you have some situations that you need to care about. If the negative is inside, if it's an even exponent, the result is going to be positive. If it's an odd exponent, it will be negative. So if it looks like this, if it's an even exponent, because you think of the negative as going along with it. And if you have an even amount, that means you've got a negative times a negative. You can pair things up. And if you can pair things up, the negatives cancel out. If you can't make a pairing, which brings us to the odd exponents, if you can't pair up like 5, you could pair 2 of them up, then you got an odd man out. So that would just cause a whole situation to be negative. You always want to be able to pair. Okay, you don't want to leave anyone out. Just think it's negative, leaving somebody out. Okay, and if the negative is outside the parentheses, the answer will always be negative. If it's outside, the answer is going to be negative. Because what that really means when I have negative a to the 4th, it's really saying negative 1 times a to the 4th, which creates that negative answer. Okay, when you have that negative on the outside, it's really just saying you're timesing it by that negative 1. So it will be negative. All right, we're going to do these, 5? Just kidding, 4 examples. Negative 4 squared. Well, it looks like this, and sometimes I'm going to have to reference what it looks like while I first try to get a hang of this, because it is a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to evaluate it as 4 squared, bring down the negative, so it will be negative 16. This is negative 2 to the 6th. I'm hoping that you can see that you can separate this 2 to the 6th and then see that that negative will just come down. 2 to the 6th, I still use my fingers. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is what, 32, times 2 is 64. So I know it's 64. Bring down the negative. Nope, no calcs today. So lots of little math, little tedious math. Negative 3 squared, hey, that looks like this, parentheses. So I have the negative inside. If it's an even exponent, my answer is going to be positive. So it's just going to be positive 3 squared, which is 9. If you feel confused at that, you can realize that the negative's going along with it. So it's negative 3 times negative 3, which is that positive 9. Negative 2 to the 4th. Again, the negative's inside parentheses, so I'm looking like this situation. I have an even exponent, so I know my answer is going to be positive. So I just go 2 to the 4th. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. It's going to be a positive 16. All right, evaluating, the lovely vocab word of evaluating. It just means plug the number in, right? Remember, evaluate, plug it in. Plug the number in for a variable. And this is where it can get super confusing. Evaluate a cubed for a is negative 3. If a is negative 3, that all of a is negative 3. Okay, all of it. And when I think all of it, I think parentheses. It is all negative 3. So I'm going to write this as negative 3 cubed. Okay? Now if you feel stuck analyzing it with this table, if it's a negative inside, we have an odd exponent that tells me my product will be negative. If you have a hard time doing that, do it by hand. You'll get the pattern eventually. This is saying negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. Order of opposite, left to right. Negative 3 times negative 3 would be a positive 9 times negative 3, negative 27. Okay? Use whatever strategy until you get confident and fluent in this. Use whatever strategy you like. Okay? Now this is saying negative b to the 4th. B is 4. It's not negative 4. I'd have to put parentheses if it was a negative 4. So it's just going to be negative 4 to the 4th. Oh, and now I got to do math. Okay, I know 4 times 4 is 16. I know that. Now I'm going to do 16 times 4.
64.
Thank you. Wait. Now I'm going to go times 4 again. 24, 256. So it would be 256, bring down the negative. Do you love this?
No.
It's a brain teaser because so many of us start second guessing ourselves. It is definitely one of the most difficult concepts for 7th graders, aside from surface area. Negative x squared. X is 10. Is the negative going to go inside parentheses or outside? What do you think? It's outside because x is just 10. So it's going to be negative 10 squared. Okay, 10 squared is 100. So what I'm hoping again that you can visualize is separating that. 10 squared is 100. Make it negative. Negative 100. I'm hoping you can see that separation. Okay, negative 2 to the, or x to the 5th, x is negative 2. Is that negative 2 going to go inside parentheses?
Yeah.
It is, because x is all of this. So I say, hey, x is all negative 2. Because when you keep it outside, you're saying x is just 2, or the base is just 2, not negative 2. So you have to make sure that the negative is inside parentheses here to the 5th. Here I use my fingers. 2 is I use my fingers a lot with exponents, and I don't know why. I'm old, and I still use my fingers. And I try to encourage my students to use theirs, more so my daughter when she's sitting at home doing homework. I try to encourage her to use your fingers with exponents, because so many kids want to write negative 10, and it's not. It's negative 2 times negative 2 is 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. times negative 2 is 16. Times negative 2 is a negative